Hello and welcome to the Starting Sisters series, where we go from your first purchase to your first 2,000 point army list and everything in between. In this video, we'll be looking at the different orders that the sisters can belong to and what benefits those orders provide to your units. Many different units in the Sisters army have orders that they belong to, and many buffs require units to be in the same order, such as the Canoness ability Lead the Righteous, which allows for rerolls on hit rolls of 1 for units of the same order as the Canoness, as long as they're within 6 inches of her. Additionally, if all units in a detachment are of the same order, the detachment gains an order conviction, which can be a rather powerful buff. However, as some units cannot belong to an order, they do not prevent you from gaining the order convictions, but they do not benefit from order convictions. Those units without an order in the codex belong to a list of exempt units, which I'll put on screen. And once again, they won't prevent you from gaining order convictions, but they do not benefit from the convictions themselves or the different buffs that are order specific. So keep that in mind when picking units and how you position them. In addition to convictions, orders also give you access to warlord traits, relics, and stratagems unique to each order. In this video, we'll look at the orders from what I believe is the best to the worst. Some ranks are easy to determine, but some are more of a best guess and can change depending on different scenarios. More so simply because one order is considered better than another does not mean you should just stick to the best orders, but rather that some are just more optimal than others, though in certain situations, even the less optimal orders can do a lot of work, and the benefits of the orders may change depending on the size of the game. The first order that we'll look at is the Order of the Bloody Rose. This is by far the most popular order, and we'll see why rather quickly. The Order of the Bloody Rose has a conviction called Quick to Anger, and their conviction gives them 2 special buffs, mostly focused on close range and melee combat. The first half is that attacks made with melee weapons or pistols have their armor penetration improved by 1. So for example, a weapon with 0 armor penetration now has a characteristic of -1. This is obviously good on units like Repentia, Zephyrim, and Seraphim, which have either primarily melee weapons or pistols. But don't forget, your Sisters units also have pistols as well, such as basic Sister Troops, Retributors, and Celestians. While this isn't vital to those units, it's a nice perk as you can fire pistols in melee combat, and it can help those units break out of melee, or at least do some damage before they are overrun and are taken off the field. The second half of the conviction states that a unit which was charged, or made a heroic intervention gains 1 attack in the attack phase. Considering Zephyrims and Repentia only have 2 attacks each, gaining 1 additional attack is rather big, and considering you can stack this with the Preacher buff that does almost the same thing, you can double the attacks of Repentia squads on a charge roll. Seeing as all these units also have Acts of Faith, they have a very easy time making a charge with Miracle Dice, especially something like the Zephyrim, who can Deep Strike and then successfully make a 9-inch charge just off of Miracle Dice. They all of a sudden are given an extra 50% efficiency simply by being in this order. The stratagem that the Order of the Bloody Rose gives you is called Tear Them Down, and for 1 command point you gain +1 to your wound rolls when making melee attacks with the selected unit. This is a rather strong ability that can really push you over the top in melee so that you're wounding on 2s with weapons that have high armor penetration and generally 2 damage. This is better on the Zephyrim of course than the Repentia, as the Zephyrim have a much lower strength profile, but it's great on both regardless and can really come in clutch when you really need it to. Unlike the conviction and the stratagem, the warlord trait Blazing Ire is not necessarily bad, but we'll see what the problem is in just a second. This warlord trait adds 1 to the attack of the warlord, and the warlord can advance and charge in the same turn. This isn't bad, but generally you'll be looking at something like Beacon of Faith or Righteous Rage for the warlord traits, as the Miracle Dice you gain from the Beacon of Faith is way too good to pass up, and Righteous Rage is better as a combat ability as it allows you to get into combat while also giving you some benefits within combat. And partially why you would want your warlord in combat, outside from granting other units buffs, is that you get a relic called Beneficence. Beneficence replaces a chain sword on the warlord, and it's a bit like a power sword, but has 1 less armor penetration in exchange for 1 more damage. However, what's really important is that it grants 3 additional attacks to the user within melee. All of a sudden your Canoness becomes a melee monster at 7 attacks and +1 attack on the charge that do 2 damage each, at a rather reasonable armor penetration rating, and she can gain many other buffs to enhance her damage and attacks. In short, you can make an incredibly powerful melee warlord with just a canoness and this relic, as well as the conviction and other buffs. As you can see, this is why the Order of the Bloody Rose is so powerful. It takes the strong melee combat of Sisters and supercharges it to the point where all of your close combat units become threats your opponent can't ignore. Even the relic turns your canoness into an army of one. All of this just makes it really hard for other orders to compete with the Order of the Bloody Rose, because it takes what your powerful units already want to do in this army and makes it even better, while all of its abilities are powerful and focused, as opposed to some orders where some abilities might be very strong but some abilities are kind of weak. The second strongest order is the Order of Our Martyred Lady. What this order really has going for them isn't necessarily the abilities, although the abilities are fine, but rather it's a special character that is known as Junith Eurita. She has one ability that buffs all sister units by giving them +1 to their Shield of Faith Invulnerable save to a maximum of 4+ if they're within 6 inches of her. This is not an order specific unit, but it is a nice buff that she provides. In addition to that, she then offers an order specific buff that allows models of the same order to reroll 1s to hit and wound if they are within 6 inches of her. At only 115 points, this is a rather powerful set of buffs she provides to your units, making a strong case for this order, as you can really use her to buff your backline and shooting. So while the Order of the Bloody Rose really buffs your melee combat and pistol shooting, Junith on the other hand is better at buffing your shooting units that have a bit of range. So something like the Exorcist, Tank, or Heavy Bolters on Retributors can benefit a lot from Junith's buffs. Now that we know what Junith is, we can look at the conviction of the Order of Our Martyred Lady. Their conviction is 2 parts like the Bloody Rose. The first being that you gain 1 miracle die in any phase that a unit with this conviction was destroyed, and this stacks with Acts of Faith ability that generate dice for a character with Acts of Faith being destroyed. This isn't bad and can generate a decent amount of miracle dice over the course of a game, especially since minimum sized units are preferred for most units, and the units you want larger squads of will usually be in Bloody Rose, such as the Zephyrum or the Repentia. And while you don't want your units dying, it's always nice to get something when that happens. And with something like this order, you'll be playing several minimum squads of Sisters troops just to hold objectives, as well as providing a little bit of extra firepower. The second half of their conviction, known as Blood of the Martyrs, says that you add 1 to your hit rolls with any unit that has had a model destroyed, even if the model was returned to battle. This can be pretty good, but hard to set up and conflicts a bit with the first half, as you want small units in general, and usually when 1 model dies in that unit, the rest are soon to follow, though sometimes you can get lucky and gain a little bit of extra mileage from this part of the conviction, though really this isn't something you should focus on, as most of the time exposing your units to damage will have them wiped out as opposed to gaining this buff. The stratagem for this order is called Honor the Martyrs, and the stratagem reads: when an enemy destroys a model with this order, you can pay 1 command point, and for the rest of the battle, when units from this order attack that enemy unit, they can reroll hit rolls of 1. This is a rather unique ability as it persists throughout the game and affects an enemy unit to buff your units. It can come in handy, but you already have a lot of abilities that allow you to reroll 1s on hit rolls, though it can help out some models in this order, especially if they're a little spread out and can't benefit from something like a Canoness or Junith. Never bad to have as a little extra benefit, but again, not something you would necessarily focus too much on, but rather something you use situationally to help your units out when it is imperative. The Warlord trait for this order is called Shield Bearer. What it does is it gives 1 extra wound and buffs the save characteristic by giving the save rolls +1 to a maximum of 2+. It's not bad and can make a Warlord rather tanky, but really competes with Beacon of Faith, which is generally a better buff, as it buffs more of your army with the miracle dice that it generates. However, as an extra Warlord trait off of something like Heroine in the Making, it might be something you can consider to get a slightly tankier Warlord, though a lot of times I feel like you'll probably be looking at something else because this isn't the most impressive ability. The relic for this order is called Martyr's Vengeance. It replaces an Inferno pistol on the Warlord if you've taken one, and what it essentially does is it's an Inferno pistol with double the range, 1 extra strength, and when you make a damage roll of d6, you roll 2 dice and you pick one of the rolls to use as the damage profile. It's not bad, but it feels like there are better choices for the most part, as 1 shot with this weapon probably won't be as important as some other options, but it's not a terrible pick either. Just think about what you're really getting when you're taking this. it's simply a buffed up Inferno pistol. And considering a unit of Seraphim can have up to 4 Inferno pistols, is it really that important to get one extra nice Inferno pistol in your army? Maybe sometimes. In conclusion, if you're going with this order, you're probably looking at taking Junith for your list, as she provides so many powerful buffs to your units. A lot of the other abilities are reasonably strong as well, such as the extra miracle dice from the Conviction, but they're more of a really nice bonus as opposed to something that you would specifically take while ignoring Junith, considering how low she is in points and how good she can be. The third order on the list is the Order of the Valorous Heart, and unlike the first two orders where the Order of the Bloody Rose buffs melee and the Order of our Martyred Lady buffs essentially shooting and miracle dice generation, this order focuses more on survivability and sustainability of your units than it does of offensive capabilities, and we can see that with the name of its conviction being Stoic Endurance. Once again, this is a two-part conviction, with both parts focusing on survivability as opposed to offense. The first part gives a feel no pain roll of 6 whenever a unit with this order loses a wound. Rather simple and rather impressive, but okay. The second half of the conviction, on the other hand, reduces the armor penetration characteristic of the enemy's attacks by 1, and more importantly, it does stack with the Imagifier's Tale of the Stoic. This can be rather powerful as you reduce armor penetration by 2 of enemy attacks, and you'll almost always run Imagifiers when running this order. It's definitely a nice ability to have, as armor penetration is rather prevalent in the game currently. By reducing the armor penetration significantly, you all of a sudden enable yourself to make a lot more use of the saves that you do have. So from the conviction alone, you can see why this is such a defensive order. But let's look at the stratagem, which isn't necessarily defensive. The stratagem is called Blind Faith. What the stratagem says is when shooting with a unit, you can pay 1 command point and ignore all hit modifiers for that unit. This was a nice option before 9th edition when modifiers stack, as you could reduce -2 to hit or greater modifiers to 0. You can still do this a bit, so it's better than just getting +1 in some cases, but it also ignores your modifiers, so it's very situational. It can still have its uses because you can still stack modifiers to a limited extent, but it's become a lot more limited than it once was. Still, there will be times where this does play a big role in a shooting phase. The Warlord trait for the Valorous Heart order is called Impervious to Pain. It gives a 5+ Feel No Pain to your Warlord. This just doesn't do enough compared to Beacon of Faith, which edges out most other traits, and this trait isn't particularly amazing to begin with, unlike some of the other choices for the orders. The Valorous Heart relic is called Casket of Penance. What it does is it subtracts 1 toughness from enemies within 1 inch of the model that carries this casket. This might be okay, but seems really underwhelming considering something like Vanguard in the AdMech army have this ability naturally and for free on a basic troop unit. The bigger issue being that the Order of the Bloody Rose is much better at melee to begin with, and while you can use this in a second detachment to help buff units from the Order of the Bloody Rose, or at least buff their attacks, they don't really need this as they're already putting out so much damage and they have so many ways to enhance their damage that this just seems redundant. I don't really see this relic playing a major part within any army at this time, but there could be some corner cases, especially at smaller games when you can affect a lot more units with this. So as you can see, the first 2 orders were a lot stronger than the third in terms of their overall package, and while the third isn't bad, it's definitely a lot more niche. More so, the top 3 orders have all placed in a top 4 of a tournament while the bottom 3 haven't. This doesn't necessarily make the bottom 3 unplayable, it just means they're not quite on the same power level within larger games. And the important thing to keep in mind is that something like the Valorous Heart order is more of a defensive order as opposed to the first 2, which really help your output, so it's a little lower on the power scale than the first 2. And I would say the 4th and the 5th order are probably capable of one-day placing in a tournament. It's just that there are abilities that give you more output are a little more specific as opposed to the first 2 orders. With that being said, let's take a look at the 4th order, which is known as the Order of the Ebon Chalice. If any order can contend with the top 3, it's probably this one, but it will require some innovation. Their conviction has 2 parts and is called Daughters of the Emperor. The first part being a Feel No Pain on a 5+, but only against mortal wounds. It's not bad, but it's very situational, which hurts the overall power, though it should be said that there are a lot of mortal wounds within 9th edition, so it will come into play more than you would think, and you would be surprised how many times you might benefit from this. The second half of the conviction states, if you perform an act of faith, you can discard a miracle die to make the miracle die you use a 6. This isn't bad as it can really buff your miracle dice, and the best way to think about this is that you're generally going to use rolls between 2 and 5 for this, so it's sort of like combining those two dice into one. It's not the strongest ability, but it does have its uses. And once again, don't think of it as just getting rid of one die, think of it as combining two dice. And if there are times when you want to combine two dice, this is a good ability to have in that situation. Just keep that in mind when playing different games. The stratagem for the Order of the Ebon Chalice is called Cleansing Flame. This is a rather expensive stratagem at 2 command points, but there might be some justification for that, as it reads, when a unit is chosen to shoot or fires Overwatch, the flamer weapons score maximum hit rolls instead of rolling to see how many hits are scored. This can be rather strong in theory, as all of a sudden a Retributor squad can put out 24 flamer shots as opposed to an average of 14 for only 100 points for the unit, and then an additional 2 command points for the stratagem. It's not the most amazing thing, but it's not bad either, although it will be rather hard to use with the limited range of the flamers, though it does add a lot of attacks to your average roll. The Warlord trait for the Order of the Ebon Chalice is actually kind of interesting. It's called Terrible Knowledge. There are 2 parts to this Warlord trait, the first being that the miracle die you generate at the beginning of each battle round is automatically a 6. And the second being that you gain D3 command points at the start of the first battle round if your Warlord is on the battlefield. This is actually a rather good Warlord trait, and while it's worse than Beacon of Faith obviously, as Beacon of Faith is really hard to beat, it's definitely something that can be taken with the stratagem Heroine in the Making as an additional Warlord trait. Seeing as at worst it refunds the command points that you spend to take this as an extra ability, but on average it will generate an extra command point in addition to the one that it refunds for that, while also buffing your miracle dice by giving you extra 6s, which can be rather meaningful throughout the course of a game. Following the Warlord trait, the relic is called Enunciation of the Creed. It's a powered up bolter with the ability to snipe characters and does more damage to psychers. And once again, I think this is one of those relics that just doesn't do enough and can be replaced with a generic relic for more benefit. All in all, this is definitely an interesting order, and the Conviction, stratagem, and trait are all decent, but require a little more playing around with than the previously mentioned orders. There's definitely room for this order to do something, but it might just need a slight tweak in order for it to be highly competitive like the Order of the Bloody Rose or the Order of Our Martyred Lady. But considering it definitely has several decent abilities, it's not out of contention. It's just that you have to kind of figure out how to make the best use of those abilities and how to optimize them in comparison to others. It does have its limitations though, so do keep that in mind as well. Coming in 5th is the Order of the Sacred Rose. Their conviction is somewhat weak, but it has 3 parts to help with each of those parts being a little underwhelming. The first is that only one model can flee in a unit when taking morale tests, as usually they'll either be wiped out or the morale won't come into play, and if you really need to pass a morale test anyway, you always have the miracle dice to use. The second part of the conviction being that when you use an act of faith, you roll a d6 and on a 5+ you gain a miracle die. Not bad, as it can help keep your miracle dice replenished, but will only replenish them 1/3 of the time on average, and only grants you 1, so using 2 for a charge roll, for example, will only give you 1 back on a 5+ if you happen to gain it back at all. And finally, the third part of their conviction is that Overwatch attacks hit on a roll of 5 or 6 instead of just a 6. This was a lot better pre-9th edition when every unit could fire Overwatch and without spending command points. Now it's way worse. Still, it's a bit of a free bonus, and considering you get 2 other abilities, even though only one of those other abilities is particularly beneficial, it's an okay benefit, and I guess it all adds up in the end. And their stratagem is called Emperor's Judgment, and what it says is for 1 command point when shooting or firing Overwatch with a chosen unit, any bolt weapon scores an additional hit on an unmodified roll of 6 to hit. This is actually pretty good when firing with units of Retributors with heavy bolters, as they get 3 shots each, and heavy bolters were buffed to have 2 damage each. On average, a full unit will only score 2 additional hits, and that's about the same as having a 5th model with a heavy bolter shooting for only 1 command point. And don't forget, you can also use a miracle die to make one of the attacks an auto 6 to generate 2 hits. So that's a pretty decent stratagem, and I'll say it's definitely something that can help make this order competitive, as it can really do some work with heavy bolter units, as well as buffing regular bolt guns and bolt pistols for whatever it's worth. Sometimes that might actually be rather relevant if you really need an extra hit. Looking at the Warlord trait, what the Warlord trait is it's called Light of the Emperor, and what it does is you gain 1 miracle die whenever using your Warlord for an act of faith. This does not stack with the part of their conviction that lets you roll in an attempt to refund miracle dice. Maybe as an extra trait to convert bad dice with random acts on the Warlord or just to refund dice. It's not amazing, but it's not awful. There might be some interesting corner case usage of this, but it's definitely very niche at best. After their trait, we'll come to the relic, and the relic is actually a rather interesting one. It's called Light of Saint Agneth. What this relic does is it replaces a Brazier of Holy Flame, and it functions the same, but if you discard a miracle die after firing it, you can fire it again within the game, unlike a normal Brazier, which is a one-shot weapon. However, if you don't discard a miracle die after firing this weapon, it cannot be fired again within the game, so at that point it becomes the same as a Brazier of Holy Fire. This is actually a pretty decent relic for generating mortal wounds, and mortal wounds are always nice to have. All in all, it's an okay order, a bit underwhelming, but it has some potential. If it had a stronger conviction ability, it would be much more interesting. The change going into 9th with the Overwatch really took away from their conviction though, so hopefully we see some kind of minor tweak to these guys to really get them back into the game. Who knows, maybe some other minor change could happen that will let these guys shine again. They do have a lot of nice abilities, but once again, they seem to fall just shy of being competitive in comparison to some of the other orders. This means that they're still playable in a lot of cases, it's just that others edge them out. Finally, in the 6th position, and coming in last, is the Order of the Argent Shroud. It has a cool sounding conviction, which is called Deeds Not Words, but unfortunately, unlike its conviction name, it doesn't seem to get the deed done. As a whole, this order is rather weak, and whereas the previous two orders have potential to see competitive play, I don't see this one as being a competitive option at all, but I'm willing to be proven wrong, as I might be missing something, who knows. Once again, their conviction is called Deeds Not Words, and unlike all the other orders which have two parts to their conviction, the Order of the Argent Shroud only has one part, and what this one ability does is it lets you advance and fire weapons as if you hadn't advanced. This ability isn't bad, and it definitely gives you more mobility, which is nice in 9th edition, considering that you want to be taking objectives and moving around the board. But Sisters has so much mobility and already likes being in melee, so this really doesn't do enough considering how many options you already have to get around the board. I guess there could be situations where this is relevant, but the biggest problem, it only affects shooting, so it is limited in that sense as well. Seeing as their conviction is playable, let's look at their other abilities to see why this order is so weak. Their stratagem is called Faith is Our Shield, and for one command point, you give a unit a Feel No Pain of 5+ in the psychic phase against mortal wounds. This is just an expensive and weak version of the Ebon Chalice conviction. I'm not really sold, especially when you consider how easily Sisters can prevent psychic powers when they use Deny the Witch, considering their miracle dice, considering sacred rites, and all kinds of other things. I just don't really understand why this stratagem would be particularly useful. It just seems like there are better ways of accomplishing this. Their Warlord trait isn't much better. It's called Selfless Heroism, and it's a super wordy ability, but essentially it extends the heroic intervention by 3 inches of the Warlord and allows them to fight first in melee. Doesn't seem worth it even as an extra ability off of something like Heroine in the Making. It's way too situational, and if you really want your Warlord to act as a melee screening unit, you're just better off going the Order of the Bloody Rose or pretty much anything else, to be honest. This, you shouldn't be putting yourself in a position where an extra 3 inches will make or break your heroic intervention, and there's still situations where the fight first might not even matter. And finally, their last special item is the Relic, which is called Quicksilver Veil. It gives -1 to hit to enemies, making an attack against the model with this. It's an okay ability, but it doesn't really make up for all of their other issues. The issue I'm seeing with this order is that nothing really stands out about this order, and the sum of the parts are, for the most part, rather weak, as only the conviction does something exciting, but even then it's not something the Sisters are dying to have. I like the theme of this order, and it has some rather cool sounding names for its abilities, but it doesn't seem like it's very playable, and even smaller games don't seem to really make up for some of their issues, like you would have with some other orders where some war gear or something like that can really do a lot of work in smaller size games. And that's really the thing when you have something like this where one ability is really the only thing that kind of stands out. You need that ability to really do a lot of work. Unfortunately, it just isn't the case here. Anyway, thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this, please like and subscribe for more content in the future. Thank you and have a great day. Bye.